So I'd like to start with a discussion around climate risks is obviously something that's really been a very big theme. We certainly started there, and I think it's been weaved through many of these presentations. We recognise that we've naturally got a highly variable climate, but it's not going to get any less variable. It's only going to get more variable from what the science is telling us. I'm interested in how we go about firstly being able to quantify and understand those risks, but also how we respond to those sorts of risks. And certainly, I'm sure many of you are keen to let Janice and Owen share some of their thoughts around how we quantify this stuff and whether we use historical or adaptive risk-based or some other thing. So happy to have part of that discussion, but also keen to invite other panelists around how you're going about trying to quantify these sorts of climate risks and how you manage those sorts of risks into the future. So I know Janice, you'd asked to respond to Owen very, very early on. So I'll give you the opportunity to start us off, and perhaps if the panelists, it might be best to manage the number of panelists. If you can put your hand up, I think you should be able to do that. Put your hand up if you'd like to add. I'll certainly do a bit of directing, but if you'd like to contribute other than Janice and Owen, certainly put your hand up and I'll loop you in. So Janice, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I was just going to respond to Owen's comment that I'd set him up to fail with my presentation, which definitely wasn't the intent at all. But I think what Owen presented and also what he said was, highlighted a problem which is, endemic across the water industry. And I know I find it within the Bureau and that's the difference between the information that climate scientists can provide to engineers and planners as opposed to the type of information that is required by engineers and planners, people such as Owen, because, you talk to a climate scientist and they say, for example, and this is a discussion that's been taking place within the Bureau this week, is, you look at the design rainfalls and they say, you can't use, historic record, it's non-stationary. And so you say, well, what do you use? And they go, well, it could be 10%, could be 20%. And I think this is where there is the problem that, yes, we know the climate is changing, but, you have to plan on something. And at the moment, all we have is the historic record and some very hand-wavy type answers. And I think part of that is, why you need to do risk assessment because there isn't a deterministic approach. But on the other hand, that's a big paradigm shift. And what we do have at the moment is, systems such as Icon Water have set up with models and stochastic modelling. And we've got to narrow that gap between what the climate scientists will provide and what is actually needed in practice.
Yeah, and I'm interested, certainly Owen and Cougar, in your presentations. Obviously, when you're providing water supplies to communities, it's just not acceptable for somebody to turn on the tap and there not to be water coming out. So obviously, this is a really live issue for you. If we're heading towards a drying climate, you need to assume something worse than what we've experienced. But what is that, and how do you do that? What numbers do you put into your models to test that? So I know it is a live question, and this sort of risk-based adaptive approach is quite a paradigm shift. So any further thoughts on that Owen and Cougar, particularly in your spaces where the consequences of failure are just not acceptable?
Yeah, one other thing that's come up recently has been a lot of work on prehistorical data. So getting back into the last 1,000 years of climate data rather than just using the last 100, and the certainty of the understanding that I guess the surrogate parameters that are used make it a little bit hard to take as certainty, but they do talk about certain centuries being extremely dry, and while climate change is definitely a problem for us, we might actually be in a wet century, and that's why we've actually had so much rain, and maybe what could be expected, even if you take out climate change, is a much drier next 100 years. So the using 100 years to extrapolate out to 500,000 or whatever is very brave, and even if you took 10 times that much and used 1,000 years, you could get into problems as well. So some utilities and certainly New South Wales government has been using that data and putting that into their stochastic base data and extrapolating from that, and that's quite fascinating because they end up with a much drier base case, if you like. But what they tend to do is have a less extreme climate change on top of that, and so we all end up in the same position anyway. So yeah, but Janice's points about what the data we need going forward is bang on. And well, as I said, the GCMs are really good with the temperature, and I'm happy to trust them just based on how well they've performed over the last 10 years. But once we get to rainfall and obviously even further runoff, it gets even worse. As I said, I just want to raise that risk that we had, and that was that we have trouble, we can't extrapolate forward, and that is that converting the rainfall into runoff and how that relationship seems to change over time. I thought the groundwater study by Sharon might have some answers in it. That might be part of it, but I've got some other hypotheses on it as well. So yeah, some more answers around that would be extremely valuable to Icon Water.
Yeah, Kugo?
Yeah, I might add. So one thing with the YAS is well, the safe yield or whatever we can extract is going to decrease with the climate change. I haven't shared anything, but it's one of those things that's going to drive some discussions with the ACT, and because we have to seek more water. So, overall catchment thing, where would the water come from, and where are the people going to be located, and whether it's ACT or here. So that is one part of the thing. I think I'm more, the one I'm struggling with so far is our, we talk about adaptation of climate change. It can be many things, but when we design our stormwater systems, water treatment plants, and so forth, what are we going to rely on? And I think the thinking or the concepts or is slow to infiltrate or to take up, because we found that we still use the old ones, so it should be all right, but it's not all right, because even 5 days and 5 times a year you get a boil water alert, then what's the point? So I think that's something that has to happen at a higher level with Paul. I think Paul is there, but I think there are other people in the DPE now. So that's some of the, that's one of the things that's been delaying our water upgrade. There are 2 aspects.
Thanks, Kugo. I'm going to bring Ralph, and then Martin, I'll bring you in after Ralph as well. Ralph, you've obviously talked about some of the water quality challenges. Obviously, just the temperature increases in itself is obviously going to have increased risks around a lot of our water quality issues in the ACT. Keen to have some of your perspectives around how you manage and quantify these sorts of things.
Well, I mean, I guess first comment just on that is that a lot of the water quality assets are relying on plants to do filtering. And of course, in a dry period, it's conceivable that some of the plants could die. So we need to take that into account and try and obviously get ones that are fairly resilient and can very quickly regrow or something like that. But to be honest with you, actually, I found that the whole first 2 talks really stimulating that way, and that I always have in the back of my mind things like risks, but I guess I don't explicitly think in terms of risks in the more agile approach, because I'm probably lean more towards Owen's deterministic type approach. But I actually liked what Owen did with trying to figure out what the risk was by saying what's the worst year, and then let's see how many of those we can have in a row before we break the system. I'm just wondering if others have any. I found it compelling. I'm just wondering if others found it compelling as well, as a way of marrying the deterministic and the risk-based sort of approach.
I can certainly share from my experience. So I was actually the New South Wales government's water drought coordinator during the last drought. And one of the themes that came up for us was often it wasn't the variability in the actual inflows that was the major problem. It was how long the drought went for was the big issue. And so you could try to estimate, is it going to get 10 gigs of inflows or 15 gigs of inflows? But ultimately that didn't matter. It was the fact that historically we had 2-year droughts, and now we've had a 3-year drought, and that extra duration was the critical issue. And so I think that concept of saying, well, how long can you sustain it for is quite a powerful concept, because in our experience, certainly that was the case. The duration was more important than the actual magnitude of the low inflows. Martin, I'd be interested to hear some of your perspectives of the landscape scale.
Thanks, Michael. And yes, I can only speak from my experience and observations from around here and travelling the country. There is no doubt that we drained it. I drained country before. We cleared it all. We poisoned it all, and we affected the climate dramatically. That study I did where tested the temperature on a weir and a dam on the same day, and there was a 30% difference in temperature from 28 degrees to 18 degrees. That is phenomenal in the amount of evaporation that's happening and water loss out of the system. The fact that Gilimatongs never stopped flowing. It used to be an ephemeral stream that just flowed in floods and then was dry during summer. And since we reinstated the weirs and plugged up the drainage system effectively, it's never stopped flowing. And I built it in 2007, 2009, we had a flood. 2009, the shoal hadn't stopped flowing up in this upper reaches. It stopped flowing again in 2019, and my systems can continue to flow. One thing when we were constructing it, Peter Andrews said, is you will get more flow out of it than you had before. And a lot of the time you think, how can that happen? I've got all this exposed water, I'm going to get more evaporation and all that. But he said, when you cool the land like that, you get more dew point, and also you get less evaporation off the ground. I think Owen was talking about before that rainfall has been increasing and runoff has been decreasing in some places. And what I've observed is that if you've got bare soil, cloud soil, poison soil, whatever, it gets very hot and it evaporates during the day. And so you could get 5 mils, evaporates, 5 mils, evaporates. Whereas I've got 100% ground cover, 100% of the time green grass, I get 5 mils that goes in, 5 mils goes in. And so I actually get more water flowing out of my system than I got before. And it's so that evaporation off green grass is cooling the landscape too. There's a whole lot of dynamics there that have stopped water sucking in from the coast. And I think we've turned all that around by what we've done here anyway. Thank you.
That's great, Martin. Oh, no, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Michael. Great comments, Martin. Next to your presentation too, I found that fascinating. I've always liked that theory of retention of water in the landscape. I think it's the way to go. It's the way forward. Just to clarify what's happened to our catchments, when this happened to Googong during the Millennium Drought, we actually just assumed that it was just a land use issue, and it was exactly what you said, Martin, that it wasn't a natural coverage of stuff. There was farm dams going in there. There was all these extra things going on, and that's why we weren't getting the return that we were expecting from the water, and we had to readjust our rainfall runoff models. But what happened after this shorter intense drought is the same things happened over in the Cotter. Now, to say that the Cotter has got some different land uses and that's what's driving is a big stretch, when really predominantly it's untouched. So that's not to say the vegetation hasn't changed, and there still could be an aspect of that, or even soil chemistry or whatever. I'm no expert in all that, but I suspect there's got to be some other driving force there, because there hasn't been enough change in that catchment. Again, fire as well might contribute, but I suspect there's got to be something else going on there. So thanks.
Sadly, I'd add in there overgrazing with kangaroos.
Oh yeah, never know. Yep,
it's the same effect. Overgrazing with cattle or sheep, or overgrazing with kangaroos.
And this is a really good segue. I was keen to bring in Sharon to this discussion as well, because interested to understand, at a large scale, if there is going to be changing land use practices, presumably that is going to have some influence, and it's difficult to necessarily pick those things up when you've got such variability in our system, hydrologically. But through those longer term groundwater changes, often you're able to pick up these sorts of trends more clearly. So Sharon, I was interested in your thoughts around how you go about, can we use groundwater as a bit of an indicator to how our, things that we do to our landscapes may have an influence on the way that water moves in our system. And obviously you've given us a bit of a taste for the power of the type of work that you're doing.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Michael. And I suppose the question I'll throw back is, what kind of scale do you want to see the results in? So most of these groundwater systems, I mean, if you remember back to the hydrograph that I at least showed from those monitoring bores near Murray Embankment, yes, they were very responsive to new rainfall events, but some of those screen intervals, so the interval where the water is actually flowing into those monitoring bores, I think if I remember correctly, that particular one was about 20 to 30 metres below the surface. So that's kind of at the point where we at least think that water that far down is the stuff that's going to be interacting with the streams. I know that with some of my work that I've done in Melbourne and also previously in Brisbane, it really does depend on the type of geology and kind of the depth of the flow regimes you're dealing with. So if you're trying to have a look at things in terms of how quickly groundwater might respond to land use changes, I think actually some of those monitoring bores in Yass that had been used to monitor the dryland salinisation and at least have a look at those immediate, kind of very shallow surface processes may be very useful in doing that, because they're shallow enough that you may be able to start seeing that groundwater level recovering. But then the question into that comes cost. Who is actually going to keep, you can purchase loggers that can just sit there, but who's going to pay for those? Who's going to go out and download the data all the time? Sure, you can do limited stuff, but again, where's the money for the infrastructure going to come through? I think in terms of short-term practices, I mean, reflecting back on what Martin was saying, he didn't necessarily see changes straight away. It was something that, took quite a few years to start seeing the results on some of his practices. So we may not actually see some of these things come through in the groundwater signature for another 10, 20 years, depending on what we're doing. And I guess that highlights how environmental issues always do tend to be a bit of a wicked issue, that we try to make decisions based on the information that we have available to us. And it's not necessarily 10, 20 years down the track until we can figure out the full ramifications of that.
That's some really helpful comments. Ralph, would you like to jump back in?
Look, and just correct me or move on from me if this is going too much into the weeds. But I had a question for Sharon. I might have just missed it in your talk, but how are you accounting for fluctuations in groundwater, decreases in groundwater that might occur from pumping versus what's occurring from, balances between rainfall and evaporation and everything else that's going on? How are you accounting for, how do we know, for instance, that trend in decreasing groundwater isn't just due to, long-term pumping over that period?
No, and you're correct in that around the Murray Embankment, because part of their water supply, as both Rebecca and Cougar spoke about earlier, part of their groundwater, their water supply does come from groundwater. So you could see in the hydrograph, yes, it was going down, and that is probably a combination of, one, there's less rainfall recharging, and two, yes, increased extraction. And you do see those sorts of trends come through as well when you have a look at the bigger irrigation areas down in the lower Murray, the lower Murrumbidgee, all that, you do see that trend happening as well. I do suspect in those hydrographs that I showed with Murray Embankment, because you do, even though you have a generalised decreasing trend, you've got a decrease and then an increase, a decrease and an increase. So you can kind of see a bit of that seasonal extraction as well.
Right.
So in terms of that kind of scale, the unfortunate thing with my research is that there's, I can't remember the exact number around Murray Embankment, but they're the only sites where I've got hydrographs for, and we're talking about our entire upper Murrumbidgee catchment. So this is where we thought having a look at stream gauge data as a way to kind of talk about those broad scale processes. Then, of course, when you talk about the impact of extraction and that kind of thing, because we're dealing on such a large scale, so catchment-wide scale, a lot of those sorts of influences tend to get a bit more modulated out from those stream gauge responses.
Okay.
So in terms of doing that, and I mean that paper that I spoke about in terms of doing the regression analysis, they did an absolutely beautiful job doing the statistics around that and linking it in with climate. And these are people who understand the statistics so much more than I ever could. I'm just the geochemist, not the statistician in this regard. So in terms of modulating for those, and particularly when you have a look at a catchment like the Upper Murrumbidgee catchment, in terms of extraction, in terms of volumes of water being used, is actually not one of the biggest uses of water. One of the bigger users of water is just inflows into the streams in general, in terms of that balance. That could become, slightly different into the future as we are dealing with increasing population and changing in climate and some of these other things that have been reflected in some of these talks over and over about potentially accessing groundwater resources to supplement some of our supplies. And I know that we've also got Dalgety down in the snowy Monero that extract groundwater from really deep bores in the granites, and also Nimitabel in some of those volcanics down there. They'll actually modulate some of their surface water supplies, if not have all of their supply from the groundwater. But those bores are so deep down, they're like 100 to 300 meters below the ground. And just for them to even hit some of those areas, particularly in the granites where you start getting that deep down, and the fractures in the rock that actually hold the water can be so tight just because of the weight of all the soil and everything else that sits on top, just keeping them nice and tight and closed and stopping the water from moving through. It's just going to be very interesting to see how groundwater development might actually go on that kind of a big scale.
I love Sharon how you described the statistics as beautiful. There's probably a few of us that can relate to that.
But like that, they did an amazing job. Like I was having a look at it and being like, these are the people who really understand the statistics. As I said, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. But if you understand the question that you're trying to answer, if you understand the methods and how you can use them and the limitations, and apply it that way, and then also be completely honest about the kind of uncertainty that you have in that, it is still an extremely powerful tool. It's just when you have people trying to use methods to make things look fancy, then things could start falling apart, which is why I don't tend to use them, because I don't understand it and I don't necessarily need fancy to understand what I'm doing.
I'm keen to bring Rebecca in. There's a couple of themes that you've touched on, Sharon, there, particularly around the long-term nature of a lot of these actions. Often you're not seeing the impacts until many years down the track, but also recognising a history that really came through in your presentation, Rebecca, around the historical uses of land within the Yass Valley, and how you've been involved with the last 18 years and really seen some of the recovery and the benefits of your labour there. I guess I'm interested in two themes here, Rebecca. One is around how we go, communicating that, these sorts of stories in an effective way, but also around, the history side of things. How do we do that in a way that's constructive? I know, we're not here about, trying to blame people for any of this sort of stuff. It is what it is. How do we recognise, the history, but do it in a way that's really forward-leaning and constructive? So interested in your perspective, Rebecca, but also Martin, I know it's something you touched on in your presentation too.
Yeah, and one of the things we definitely run into as NRM practitioners is the lack of monitoring, particularly when all your work is based around funding, and funding comes in government cycles. So if you're lucky, you get a 4-year project, but 4 years of data is usually not terribly meaningful in terms of outcomes for NRM projects. So one of the things I've seen an increasing focus on, because it's cheap and because it lasts, is storytelling. So using storytelling as a way to capture history and to share the outcomes of projects, and to make sure that it goes out into the community in a way that makes sense to them. So it's not pure science. It's a little bit more, it sounds like anecdotal, but I don't want to use that word because that implies the data's not there. But it's just that it's a more approachable way of sharing project outcomes. And it's also incredibly affordable. So I remember when we were first sort of fumbling our way through doing it in the early noughties, it was, you had a template. It was all pretty rigid. With the increase in the adaptation of technology, it's great seeing people like Landcare groups making their own videos and having their own YouTube channels, because that's the sort of thing that grabs people's attention a lot more than a report. So I do think finding a way to get people to share their stories, because, you know, I've been here for 18 years, but if you think about the people whose families have been here for generations, there's so much to capture. And I think that's a really good way of doing it.
Mm. And I'm interested in your perspectives, Martin. You're really honest about how, you know, your father had done things that you realised, hey, this is not a good way to be managing this farm. I mean, nobody likes to be told they've done the wrong thing. How do you go about, you know, having those sorts of conversations with land managers in a constructive way without it becoming, you know, this defensive thing? You know, we're all wanting some good outcomes here. How do you go about doing that, do you think?
My father listened to me one day and he said, "So you're telling me everything I've done was wrong?" And that was a pretty hard thing, because, and I answered it by saying, "Listen, Dad, I did the same. I ploughed paddocks, I drained areas, I burnt things." But, you know, he took on new ideas. He brought myxomatosis into our area. He brought superphosphate in and things like that. So he was an innovator, and he obviously gave me the opportunity to question and look and things like that. So, yes, he took offence at first, but then he used to come and have a look and learn from what we're learning. And the beauty of the change practices we've got now is every day I go out and look at how I can build and learn, rather than before every day I went out and thought, what have I got to kill and fight? And so, yeah, it's a totally different mindset. Landcare's been fantastic in that process. So the 30 years I've been involved with Landcare was initially, hey, we've chopped all the trees down, we need trees to stop sheep dying of exposure. And then we realised that the biodiversity and all that was the next thing. And then we stepped out of the tree lanes into the pastures. And it was actually through Landcare that I met Peter Andrews and Christine Jones and Elan Ingham and all those sort of people. So I think we've got to first be honest with ourselves and say, yep, we've had a mentality of seeing how much we can take from the land, and at this stage, you know, we're running out of land. We're cooking it. We've got to accept all those things and then look at the positive ways we can change all that. And my easiest way is to help people change is to realise that the land gives to receive. Plants give to fungi and bacteria give back. And so they've got a giving relationship. And in the past, you know, we came from mining stock, from convicts, etc. Ours was a mentality of taking. And we need to accept that and then realise that once we start giving, we actually receive more.
Yeah, it's a very powerful concept. I'm keen to bring Paul in. I know Paul's been very active in the chat, which is great. Hopefully you've got some headspace now to join the panel discussion. But I want to pick on something that Rebecca mentioned around the importance of long-term monitoring. And I know you've obviously been developing those long-term water plans for the Murrumbidgee River and looking at achieving environmental outcomes. But it's really only effective if you've got good monitoring to be able to test to see how things are tracking. I'm interested in your thoughts around the Upper Murrumbidgee and the monitoring piece of this puzzle, and how important is it, particularly in our changing climate?
Yes, yeah, Michael, very. And Emma, my colleague's been doing a lot of work on this. I've been caught up with a bunch of stuff with Moamba and snowy sort of issues, but she's been looking into what we can do on the Murrumbidgee as well as the snowy. One of the things that we've been lucky with is that there has been, work done on, not enough, obviously. There's always more to be done, but there's been some good work done on Macquarie Perch with some Prue Hantians doing PhD work there, Mark Lindemans and others doing work there, and Andia Braidman and others, sort of doing citizen science work and various other work. So we've got a good idea. We need to know more, but we're getting a good idea about what Macquarie perch need there. Still lack a lot of information about what particular size flows do along the river. So, when we're sort of trying to figure out, well, we can go up to 1,500 meg a day from Tantangara. What does that mean as it makes its way down the channel? How much, how high does that get? What sort of point, if we can't do that every day, obviously. So, if we're looking at 500 meg a day, what's that going to do? And, does that get out of the channel? Are we sort of causing enough cleaning of the cobble beds with flows of that size and so on? So we're trying to do work. Obviously, a flow of 500 meg a day up the top near Tantangara is going to be a much different story to one that's down near the ACT border. It's a different river by the time it gets there. And a lot happens in the way through too. We've got, the Numarella and Breadbow River and various other ones coming in as well. So by the time we make our way down there, we're kind of less the effect that we would be upstream. So trying to understand what each of those flows does in different points along the river, so that we can better target the flows that we want to do. And also, like I said, what happens in the in-between times in that stretch, particularly above Yayak Creek, where it's really Tantangara flows that are going to provide the water for that stretch of 27 Ks. What happens when we turn the water off? How long will it stay? We know it's not constant either. We've been told about 3 different sections there. One that's a bit more flat and will hold water, another one that's more gorge country, very steep, and that will drain a lot more quickly. It gets back down to another sort of flatter section. So there's a lot of understanding there. We've looked at also setting up some work, or Emma particularly working with Antia and University of Canberra, and I'll put a shout out also for Fiona Dyer, has been very helpful here, or looking at what sediment, if we look at sediments on rocks, and so before one of our higher flows comes through, and go and check it out directly afterwards, what has it done? Some of those things. We're unfortunately very strapped for cash generally. We did manage to get a bit of money for this LiDAR and drone work to be able to figure out what these different potential like natural barriers to fish passage are. So where the little waterfalls are, and are they steep enough and high enough that Macquarie perch couldn't get up there? So stuff like that. We still also don't even know if blackfish are up in that section. There were some slimies up there above Yayak Creek found some years ago, and we're looking to get some more work done to find that out. And I think Antia has been doing work to make that happen as well. So there's a lot going on, but there's still plenty to be done. And I think it also gets back to the fact that government support for this program has kind of been a bit inconsistent. We were doing a bit initially in the early days of the program, then the kind of funding fell off, and it's only been the last couple of years that Emma, myself, and a few others have come back in, and it was really then in between time totally reliant on the likes of Antia and others to get some stuff done. So we've come back in with not much money, but where we can get somewhere, we're going to see if we can utilise that to find out some of those questions. And that's probably the last thing I'll note is it was probably about 3 years ago, I was writing up the plan for this Upper Murrumbidgee as part of the wider Murrumbidgee, entire Murrumbidgee catchment long-term water plan. And it was really hard to figure out what flows to target and suggest were the minimum flows that we needed for different things like a small fresh, a minimum flow, a base flow, a large fresh. There was very limited information to be able to say this is the kind of flow that we need to target. So that's the sort of gap we'd need to try and fill.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. It does sound that monitoring, and particularly the longer term monitoring, is absolutely critical to be able to assess these sorts of questions, and having that consistency of funding over a period of time is obviously massively important. And there's obviously a lot of goodwill in this catchment for people who are doing it on a voluntary basis, which is wonderful. But having that consistent long-term data set is probably worth funding, I would suspect. Ralph, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Michael. So I was just wondering, Paul, it was sort of disheartening at the end of your talk, hearing all the constraints on the flows. I'm just wondering how many years or how often you would actually get either your design flows or something close to your design flows, given those constraints? I mean, is it happening in spite of those constraints most years, or is it 1 in 3 years you get something like a design flow?
I suppose it depends what your design flow is. The amount that they kind of quoted as, up to 150 gigawatt hours, which in the end sort of relates to around about 30,000 meg a day. I mean, that'd be lovely. 30,000 meg a year for the Upper Murrumbidgee. That's kind of, I think we've had around that about 3 times now since, so probably 3 times in 10 years. And we don't really have it's hard to know how that's going to play out particularly with climate change. We've got a very small sort of period to look through here. We've had good years after 2016 with the good inflows, and this water is all in the end kind of dependent on what's happening in the Murray and Murrumbidgee. So, very wet in 2016, very wet last year, very wet this year. So we've ended up with, 3 good years since probably about 2013. So looking at about, 3 out of 9, 3 out of 10. Who knows how that's going to play out in the coming years? Obviously, if we had projected that back to 2000, this program's only really been running full on since about 2010, 11, and in fact, maybe 2012. If we had this program in place during the Millennium Drought, we would have had terrible allocations. So, we would have probably 9 years where we're talking about, 4,000 meg a day, we not even enough to run at minimum flows for 100 days out of a year of 365. So, it's really restricted, and that's why it's important for a number of those things, all of those issues of protecting it when we do have it to deliver, making sure that we can be more flexible on it, so we actually use the water the best period. One of the things that happens is, if we only had 100 days of flow that we could deliver, and we're looking and saying, right, well, we can deliver 100 days of flow, but at least Snowy Hydro must deliver 32, enough to provide 32 meg a day at Mittagang. Let's try and work in those bits in between. Well, we can't. We have to set it a year in advance. So if for some reason they saw and thought, we were meant to deliver 30 or so today because it's getting dry down near Mittagang. Oh, okay, look at the timetable. Actually, tomorrow there's a flow being paid for by environmental flow. Very good. Our flow gets delivered and they basically get a free run. So we are covering for the need that would eventually basically supporting the Coomer's water supply. So there's a bunch of things like that, which really hamstring it. We're really hamstrung by. But having said that, I think we're moving in a positive direction. Firstly, this didn't even exist. 15, 20 years ago, there was no environmental water. Now we've got it and we're seeing what the problems with it are, and it's a matter of slowly working through those. Some of them will have easier things. I think that protect from irrigation might be doable. Other things about just not having enough water full stop, that's going to be a bigger one. So there's going to be some stuff, but we're definitely better placed than we were 10 years ago.
So I might finish with a few reflections on today. I've certainly been trying to take as many notes as possible throughout the day to get a bit of a sense for what we've covered, and we've certainly covered a lot, which I think is important because there's so many elements to this whole water picture, even just in one catchment. And I think that's been a very strong message that's come through, is about the importance of understanding those connections, that water isn't just some isolated thing. It actually moves all the way through the landscape and up in the atmosphere and all around again. And to recognise that it's a complete system, and we change one part of the system, that has implications for other parts of that system. I don't think we've used the term systems thinking, but I think it's really come out through today that we've got various different parts of this system that we interact, whether it's at the landscape scale or the subcatchment scale in the Yass River, or at the Upper Murrumbidgee catchment scale. We've all got bits of this puzzle, and getting together, we're actually able to see more of the piece of this puzzle that actually connect together, and what we do over here can impact on what happens over the other side. So for us, just getting together to share today, I think has been a massively valuable and important thing. Your surface water and groundwater, water quality and quantity, historical actions with future risks, water for consumption versus water for environment and social and cultural purposes. There's a whole lot of these sorts of dichotomies and tensions that have come up in bits today. One thing that's come through is that these challenges aren't getting any easier. I think we've had a lot of challenges, and we're in a complicated system, and climate, changing climate is only going to make things harder for us. And so recognizing those sorts of challenges has been really important, but also to say, look, there is a whole lot of good things going on. So I think we've got two sides of that coin that's come out today. Later on, it's certainly been theme around monitoring, the importance of being able to get good data and good long-term monitoring. Having that sustainability of good data is absolutely critical. And my sense is that the funding requirements for monitoring isn't large, but it's that consistency and longevity of the monitoring is the critical aspect. So I think that's certainly something worthwhile taking back, Maxine, is the value of having that consistent funding, certainty of funding, particularly for some of that baseline monitoring, is absolutely critical, and will probably pay for itself multiple times over the years if that consistency is maintained. So I think that's certainly a good theme that's come up. The storytelling and the strong advocacy has been a really strong theme. I think Martin's been a great advocate for that and telling his story on the land for many years. But also Rebecca's story in the Yass Valley catchment over the 18 years she's been involved there too. I think these are stories we need to keep telling and promoting, and certainly the UMCN will be active in doing that, and certainly sharing the videos and the resources that we've got to our networks as widely as possible. There's a lot in the Snowy Water Licence. We've only really scratched the surface there. As I mentioned, we'll be going there for sure later on this year. You'll hear more and more about that. There's a lot of opportunities there that they're not going to be easy, and there's sort of long-term challenges. As we said, multiple governments, multiple tensions there, electricity, water supply, environment, all mixed in. But I think there are some opportunities to explore further there. So there'll certainly be future opportunities to engage in that. Young people connecting and sharing with nature, reading the landscape, and don't worry about being wrong, but worried about not learning. I think they're really valuable lessons for us to be taking away from today. So look, from my perspective, it's been really refreshing, really interesting. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure many of you have too. There's going to be other opportunities for us to have discussions like this. So Claire, perhaps you might be able to share the next one. I think it might be, is it the 18th of May is our next general meeting for the UMCN. You might want to clarify that. We're also going to be having another large forum like this on a water theme later in the year. So certainly keep your eye out on that. And it may well be more around this sort of snowy theme, system scale theme, because there's certainly a lot more to explore in that. I know there's quite a bit of interest in that. Wonderful. Okay, well, we might wrap it up there. I really want to thank the presenters for all the wonderful presentations and for contributing in the panel discussion. That's been wonderful. And also particularly want to thank Claire for doing an incredible job organising pretty much the entire session today, and Andy for doing all the tech stuff as well. They've done an amazing job. Certainly wouldn't have happened without them. So thank you so much to both of you. It's been a really worthwhile forum. We were hoping it was going to be a face-to-face. Obviously, it was difficult for us to know. We went for the safe route, but it brings the technical challenges, and Andy, having you to help support that's been really valuable too. So thank you to you both. And we'll look forward to seeing many of you at our next sessions. 18th of May will be the next opportunity with the MDBA, which I'm sure will be very interesting too. So thank you all, and have a great afternoon.